Is China taking over the US housing market, and how concerned do you need to be about it? That's the topic that we're going to cover in today's video, and I'm going to use hard data to answer this question. Now, I know this is something a lot of you are concerned about because here we are in August 2021 and home prices in America have never been higher, especially compared to wages and how much money people make. That means that Americans are getting priced out of the housing market and we're slowly but surely becoming a nation of renters. The last thing we need are foreign investors from countries like China as well as other ones around the world coming into America, buying up homes and making it more difficult for Americans to compete. So in this video, I'm going to use data to show you just how big of a problem this is and how concerned you need to be about it. The first thing we're going to do is look at how much of the US housing market a country like China buys up. Then we're going to look at where they buy homes because it's not all over the US, it's specific parts of the country. And then the final thing we're going to do is look at how much this foreign demand is changing over time, particularly in the last couple of years. You are not going to believe the differences in how many homes countries like China are buying now compared to 5 years ago. These numbers are going to shock you. All right, guys, let's get into the data. So how much of the US housing market does a country like China own? How many homes and what's the dollar value of those homes that foreign investors from China have purchased? And that's what we're looking at on this graph. We're looking at the 5 countries that have the biggest ownership share of the US housing market. And we can see number 1 is China. Investors from China have bought over $200 billion in the US housing market over the last decade from 2011 to 2021. This is data that comes from the National Association of Realtors. They put out an annual report each year showing what foreign demand for the US housing market looks like. And you can see that China is by far in the driver's seat in US housing market demand. Interestingly, number 2 is Canada. Over $125 billion of the US housing market has been purchased by foreign Canadian investors. China and Canada, they're the top 2. Then we go India, UK, and Mexico, where around 50 to 60 billion of the US housing market has been purchased by these countries over the last 10 years. And these numbers are pretty shocking. I mean, over $200 billion worth of homes purchased by foreign investors from China over the last decade. That's no small number. That's hundreds of thousands of homes being purchased and owned by investors from China who don't really live in America and who are kind of taking homes away from Americans who are trying to buy them. And I think the other surprising thing from that graph is Canada. I mean, no one thinks about Canada in terms of like countries that could be buying up US real estate, but they are the number 2 country doing that. And so it's really important to think about like where this foreign demand is coming from. And it's additionally important to think about where are they buying? Because this is really the key point. A lot of people like to think of the US housing market in aggregate as far as this foreign investor demand goes, but it's actually very specific places that these countries, investors from these countries are targeting. It's not as if they're going to every single state and buying an equal amount of homes. In fact, certain states across the country have almost no foreign demand, while other states have a very high level of foreign demand. So it's really important to understand where they're buying so you can know if like you live in a certain area, am I going to have to compete with a foreign investor from China or Canada or Mexico or in India when I'm going to buy my home? And you can see that represented on this map where we are looking at the states that have the highest level of foreign home buying demand from China specifically. So the states with the most demand coming from China. And you could see, you know, this should jump off the page to you. It jumped off the page to me right away, is how much demand is flowing into California from China. Over 1/3 of all the Chinese home purchases in America were in California. So you can't really like divorce those two. You need to think about Chinese investor demand. Well, you got to think about California because that's where the bulk of it is going. And when you think about it, I guess it's not that surprising. We obviously know that culturally speaking, there's a huge Chinese influence in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. And there's also a lot of direct flights from China to California. So that's why you likely have a big presence of Chinese investor demand. But it's not only in California. If we actually go to the East Coast, we can see here that New York State accounts for 8%. And then if we were to total up the individual numbers here in New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, that comes out to about 13 or 14%. So the Northeast in general also gets a large slice of Chinese investor demand. Over 20% of Chinese purchases are in the Northeast. If you guys are enjoying this content, please just help me out and hit that like button. When you do that, it helps me with the YouTube algorithm, gets me a bit more exposure, and when I get more exposure, it actually allows me to put more time in doing more of these videos. If you like this content, want to see more of it, hit that like button. Additionally, make sure to comment. I want to hear your perspective on the US housing market. What are you seeing as a buyer or seller? When you guys comment, it makes these videos better. All right, let's get back to it. But of course, there are big differences depending on where the demand is coming from. This is the map for China, but the map for China foreign demand does not look at all like the map for Canada, which is what we are now looking at, where Canadian foreign investors buy homes in the US housing market. And we can see all of a sudden that no longer is California even close to number one. Florida is now number one. 38% of all the Canadian investment in the US housing market goes into the state of Florida. The other place where there's a lot of Canadian demand is in Arizona, where nearly a quarter of all the Canadian home purchases occur in Arizona. And so you can tell that the Canadian investors really like the Sun Belt. They have a little bit of a presence in California, but not so much. Now, I'm going to show you one more foreign buyer map, and that's from Mexican buyers. We can see that Mexican buyers also, again, look very different from the other two. All of a sudden, Texas now vaults to number one among Mexican buyers. Nearly 30% of foreign buyers from Mexico are buying in Texas. Not surprising, given that they share a border. Additionally, a lot of Mexican buyers are in California as well as scattered around the Sun Belt, and also a big presence in Colorado. So it's simply not enough to know, the overall statistics for foreign demand in the US housing market. You actually need to know where these investors are buying. And as you saw in the graphs, California is a big one, especially among investors from China. We didn't look at it, but investors in India also buy in California a lot, as well as investors in Mexico. So California has a huge amount of foreign investment demand, as does a place like Florida. Although Florida's investment demand doesn't really come from China or India, it comes from Canada and it comes from Latin America primarily. Over 40% of all the foreign homes purchased in Florida come from Latin America. And interestingly, none of those Latin American countries are big enough on their own kind of to make that top 5 list. But when you add up Dominican Republic and Cuba and Venezuela and Colombia, when you add them all up, it's a lot of real estate demand specifically in Florida. Another thing we need to talk about, especially for people who live in these states that you saw on these maps with a lot of demand coming from foreign buyers, is the competition factor in terms of making an offer, and that a lot of these foreign buyers are extremely wealthy. I mean, after all, if you're buying real estate in America and you live in India or the UK or Mexico or Canada, you are very wealthy, most likely, right? Like, you wouldn't go halfway across the world to buy real estate unless you had a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars often. And the unfortunate thing there is that a lot of these foreign buyers are all cash buyers. So they'll swoop in, they'll see a listing, and they'll say, hey, I have all cash. They'll maybe get a local partner or a local realtor and say, hey, I have all cash. Just go get the home, sign it up immediately. And that's what's happening, especially in places like California, is that the foreign all-cash buyer comes in and basically prices out, shoves out the traditional American buyer, who often just needs to, get a mortgage, right? Like a traditional mortgage, remember those things? And that takes time, 30 to 60 days to get approval. While the foreign all-cash buyer comes in and has a huge advantage over the traditional American buyer as far as that goes. And you can see what I'm talking about on this graph, where we're looking at the percentage of purchases that were made in cash between foreign buyers versus the total sales in the housing market. So the blue line is foreign buyers making purchases in cash. The yellow line is the entire housing market making purchases in cash. And you can see that foreigners tend to make way more all cash purchases. Like, if we go all the way back to 2011, 62% of all foreign purchase transactions were in cash compared to 29% in total. And so there's really this 20 to 30% delta between these two, showing that foreign buyers have the ability to make cash offers much easier than the rest of the housing market in America. Now, we can see today that roughly 40% of all foreign transactions, foreign sales are all cash compared to 20% in the housing market in general. Now, I think the interesting thing that a lot of you, astute observers are probably noticing on this graph is that the share of all cash transactions has actually gone down quite a bit for both foreign buyers and both the market in general. And I think that's kind of a surprising realization. I don't think a lot of people would have suspected that. I know I didn't suspect that, because I feel like all you hear about over the last year is that we have all these all cash transactions in the market, but actually we have fewer all cash transactions today than we did 10 years ago. And that's a bit perplexing, right? Because all you hear about in the news is, oh my God, all these buyers are coming in cash, whether they be foreign or whether they be BlackRock or Zillow, they're coming in cash and just buying homes. But that type of thing is actually happening much less today than it did 10 years ago. And I think there's one simple reason for that, and that's because 10 years ago, we were really at the bottom of the last housing market crash. And home prices were really, really cheap in America 10 years ago. I mean, the typical price declined by about 30% across the country, and then it declined by about 50 or 60% in certain markets like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Riverside, California. So when home prices got so cheap, that actually enabled more people to buy in cash, right? Because if a home went from being $400,000 to $200,000, well, it's a lot easier to pony up the cash on a $200,000 purchase than $4. And as home prices have gotten progressively more expensive in America over the last decade, and particularly over the last year, the ability for both foreign buyers, investors, and local Americans to make that all-cash purchase has gone down. Now, it's at this point that we need to address the elephant in the room that I think a lot of you are curious about. And that's not just, who are the big foreign players in U.S. real estate and where they're buying, but like how much more are these countries, foreign investors from these countries buying today in 2021 than they were 3 years ago or 5 years or 10 years ago? But this is really the key question that needs answering because, if these countries are buying more and more of the U.S. housing market, that would be something to really, really be concerned about. In comparison, if they're buying the same amount or they're buying less in the housing market today than they were in the past, then maybe we breathe easier. And we know that the craziness in the market today isn't necessarily being caused by foreign buyers. So now the data I'm going to show you is the amount of homes being purchased. The amount of homes being purchased each year by a country like China, investors in a country like China or Canada, and how that's changed over time. This is really the key insight that I think you guys need right now. And that's what we're looking at on this graph. Each line is a different country in the top 5 for foreign buyer demand. Canada in blue, China in red, Mexico in white, India in yellow, UK in purple. And we're looking at the number of homes they've purchased in the US each year going back the last decade. And this is really the key data set we need to look at. And if we go all the way back to 2011, we can actually see that back in 2011, Canada was really the big dog. Foreign investors from Canada back in 2011, 2012 were flooding into the US housing market buying homes. China was in second place, but like much closer to Mexico, India, and the UK. But things started changing around 2014, 2015. The Canadian demand in the market declined, while the Chinese demand in the market shot up. And in 2017, 2018, China was the big player. They were buying over 40,000 homes a year, 2017, 2018 across America. But what we've seen actually for every country now in the last couple of years is that the amount of homes that they're purchasing is actually declining significantly. And like not just declining by a little bit, but like getting cut in half or getting cut by 60, 70%. I mean, in 2021, over the previous 12 months, Canada's only bought 9,000 homes. China's only bought 6,000 homes. These were numbers that were at 40, 50,000 only 5 to 10 years ago. So the amount of homes being purchased by these foreign investors is actually falling off a cliff over the last couple of years. You can see that further represented on this graph. We're looking at the percentage of existing home sales in America purchased by foreign investors. If we go back to 2010, we can see that there was about 300,000 homes purchased by foreign investors on 4.3 million existing home sales. So that was roughly 7% of all the sales in the market back in 2010 were from foreign investors. Fast forward today, that number is all the way down to 1.9% of the sales and demand in the housing market over the last 12 months is from foreign investors. So we went from being 6.9 to 1.9%. So actually, these foreign buyers had a much bigger influence and a much bigger share of the U.S. housing market 10 years ago coming out of the last housing crash than they do today. And if you guys are surprised, I get it. I was just as surprised when I looked at this data. And again, this comes from the National Associations of Realtors. Each year they come out with an international report showing where all the foreign demand is coming from in the U.S. I'll link to it in the description so you can look at it yourself. Lots of great data in this report from the National Association of Realtors. But I was really, really surprised to see this. I mean, because again, all you kind of hear about in the narratives and the tabloids is investor foreign demand. I see it in the comments. A lot of you guys talk about investor foreign demand, but when you look at the data, that demand is dropping considerably over the last couple of years and is well below where it was 10 years ago. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. The first one, which relates to actually China specifically, why we've seen China drop off from 40,000 homes to less than 10,000 homes purchased in a year, is due to capital controls. Xi Jinping, the Prime Minister of China, he in 2017 enacted strict reforms on allowing Chinese citizens to take money out of the country. And basically, it's very difficult if you live in China to take your Chinese yuan and then to convert it to US dollars and move it and invest it in other countries. That's very, very difficult. And it's actually not just America where Chinese foreign investment's fallen off. Chinese investment in the UK, in Australia, places like that has also fallen off a cliff over the last 5 years. So the capital controls enacted by the Chinese government starting in 2017 have definitely had a huge, huge impact on tamping down that Chinese demand. The second thing relates to exchange rates. In the early to mid 2010s, the US dollar was getting a lot stronger relative to other currencies. And when the dollar was getting stronger, I think a lot of investors from foreign countries said, hey, the US is a really good, safe place for us to park our money. Because if you take, for instance, yuan or the British pound and you buy a US home in US dollars, well, if the US dollar gets stronger, you make more money, even if the underlying home didn't appreciate. So I think that appreciation of the US dollar was fueling things in 2014, 2015, 2016. But starting around then, the dollar started weakening. And when the dollar started weakening, I think a lot of the existing owners from those countries were like, I got to sell. I don't want the dollar to get weaker, which is going to make my investment perform worse relative to my local currency. So that's why I think 2017, 2018, 2019, you saw demand decline. And of course, with all the money printing from the Fed over the last year, the dollar has weakened even more. So a lot of foreign investors probably don't want to invest into an American US asset like a housing market when the dollar is depreciating. And then I think the final thing for especially the last 12 to 15 months is the pandemic. I mean, international travel is basically non-existent, around 90% below its pre-pandemic levels. So, if you're a foreign investor in the UK or India or China and you can't come to the US, or it's difficult for you to come to the US and actually see, the investments or the homes that you want to buy, then you're much less likely to participate in the housing market. So I think as long as international travel stays restricted, these things are going to continue to occur as far as like lessening foreign investor demand in the US housing market. Now, I felt a sense of relief after looking at this data because I was concerned, right, that foreign buyers were coming in and making it more difficult for Americans to buy homes. And the fact that that's not happening does make me feel better that American families, still have a better shot at buying a home. At least it's not going to be a foreign investor that comes in and buys it out from under them. However, I'm also left feeling not so great because if it's not, foreign demand that's causing the craziness in the US housing market right now with record levels of appreciation, according to the Case-Shiller Home Index, with prices at their highest level ever relative to wages in the economy, if it's not the foreign demand that's causing this and pricing out Americans, then what is? It's got to be something domestic. And I think that's kind of the disturbing thing here is that it's actually something domestic, something within America that's making the housing market so difficult, so expensive, pricing out so many Americans. And, if you've watched my channel, I've done videos on, some of the boogeymen for the U.S. housing market. BlackRock is one of them. And I don't really think a company like BlackRock is really participating much in the housing market. I don't think a lot of the hedge funds and REITs are really participating much in the housing market, nor now do I think that foreign buyers are. However, there is one entity which I do think is having a significant impact on pushing home prices up and pricing out Americans. What is that entity? It's Zillow. I did a video on this a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to do another one next week talking about how it's going to be Zillow's mission, literally their mission, their CEO came out and said it, to take over the US housing market and to make sure prices never go down. So it's not China, it's not foreign governments, it's not BlackRock, it's Zillow and also companies like Opendoor, which are basically flipping homes, speculating on the housing market, and making it harder for you to buy a house. I'm going to have more on that next week. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I spent a lot of time putting this content together. All the graphs you saw, all the maps you saw are ones that I created myself in Tableau graphing software using the data from the National Association of Realtors report. And so if you do appreciate this content and you want to see it more, subscribe to this channel. I have 2 to 3 of these videos coming out per week, and I'd love for you to become a subscriber and watch more of them. Additionally, think about joining the channel and becoming a sponsor. If you become a sponsor, you can actually have an input and influence on the videos that I do in the future. Why did I actually pick this topic for this video? It's because the sponsors of my channel, I polled them and they said this is the one that I should do. So if you actually want to have an influence and suggest which videos I should do, think about becoming a sponsor and joining. It's only $5 a month. You support me financially and you get to have an impact on the content in this channel. All right, guys, I'm going to see you all next week when I talk about Zillow's takeover of the U.S. housing market. Until then, this is Nick from New Venture Consulting signing off.